What would you do if your own son packed your suitcase, drove you to a nursing home, and told you that your bedroom was needed for his dog? That sounds like the kind of story people exaggerate online. The kind that makes you shake your head and say, no child would actually do that. But 3 months ago, that's exactly what happened to me. And here's the part most people find strange. But before we continue, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't even raise my voice. I just watched. I watched my son carry my suitcase to the front door like it was a normal afternoon. I watched him check his phone while the car pulled into the driveway. And I watched him smile politely when he told the driver, "This is my mom. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 72 years old. I lived in the same house for 32 years, the same house my husband and I bought when Daniel was just a baby. That house saw everything. Birthday parties. Graduations. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper all over the floor. And the night my husband collapsed in the kitchen 12 years ago. After he died, that house became very quiet. But it was still mine. My memories were in every wall, every creaky floorboard, every corner of the backyard where Daniel used to run around chasing a soccer ball. For a long time, it was just me there. Then 3 years ago Daniel called me one evening. His voice sounded tired. "Mom. Things are a little tight right now," he said. His company had downsized. His savings had taken a hit after a business idea that didn't work out. And suddenly he needed a place to stay for a little while. Just a few months, he promised. Of course I said yes. He was my son. A few weeks later he arrived with his wife Melissa. She was 39, always perfectly dressed, always scrolling through home renovation photos on her phone. They also brought their golden retriever, Baxter. At first it felt lively again. The house wasn't quiet anymore. Baxter ran through the hallway chasing tennis balls. Melissa rearranged furniture. Daniel cooked dinner sometimes, like he used to when he lived there as a teenager. But slowly, something started changing. Little things. Melissa would stand in the doorway of my bedroom sometimes, just looking around. One afternoon she said, "This is such a big room for one person." I laughed it off. But then she started talking about how the house could be improved. Walls could come down. The kitchen could be modernized. The backyard could have a deck. Daniel started using strange language too. He'd say things like "our house" when he talked to contractors. At first I assumed he meant the family home. But after a while, it sounded like he believed something else. Like the house already belonged to him. Have you ever noticed how entitlement grows quietly? It never arrives loudly. It creeps in through small assumptions. Melissa started ordering furniture without asking. A new couch appeared in the living room. Then a dining table. Then shelves that replaced the ones my husband had built with his own hands. One evening I walked into the kitchen and saw Baxter eating from a brand new ceramic bowl that said "King of the House." I remember thinking that was funny. But it turned out, it wasn't a joke. About 6 months ago the conversation finally happened. Daniel knocked on my bedroom door and sat down on the edge of my chair. He looked uncomfortable. "Mom," he said slowly, "we've been thinking about what's best for everyone." That sentence always makes me nervous. Whenever someone says "what's best for everyone," it usually means something is about to happen that's not best for you. Melissa stood behind him in the hallway. Daniel cleared his throat. "You know Baxter needs space to run around," he said. "And your room is the biggest one in the house." I stared at him. I honestly thought he was joking. But he wasn't smiling. "We thought maybe you could move somewhere with better care," Melissa added from the doorway. Better care. I was still driving. Still cooking. Still paying the property taxes. But somehow I suddenly needed care. A week later my suitcase appeared beside the front door. No conversation. No discussion. Just, packed. The morning they drove me away was strangely calm. Daniel loaded my bag into the car. Melissa stayed inside with Baxter. The dog was running happily down the hallway toward my bedroom. My bedroom. Daniel drove quietly the entire way to the nursing home. Not once did he ask if I was okay. Not once did he ask if I wanted to go somewhere else. He just parked in front of the building and said, "This will be good for you, Mom." Inside, a nurse greeted us kindly. Her name was Carla Jimenez. She looked like someone who had worked in healthcare long enough to recognize uncomfortable situations instantly. She asked me a few questions. My age. My medications. My emergency contact. Daniel filled out the paperwork quickly. He signed several forms without reading them very carefully. I noticed that. And I also noticed something else. Carla kept glancing between the forms and my son. Finally she paused. She looked directly at Daniel. And in a calm voice she asked a question that made the entire room go quiet. "Is this the same son," she said slowly, "who thinks that house belongs to him?" Daniel stopped writing. He looked up. And for the first time that day, he looked confused. Why would a nurse ask a question like that? Think about it. You're checking someone into a nursing home. You see hundreds of families every year. People come in sad, worried, sometimes relieved, sometimes overwhelmed. But rarely, confused. Yet when Carla looked at Daniel, her expression wasn't sympathy. It was curiosity. And that's when my son realized something wasn't unfolding the way he expected. Daniel lowered his pen slowly. "What do you mean?" he asked. His voice sounded cautious now. Carla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the intake folder again and flipped through a few pages. Her eyes paused on one line in particular. Then she looked back at me. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said gently, "would you like a glass of water?" I nodded. The moment she left the room, Daniel turned toward me. "What was that about?" he asked. I simply folded my hands in my lap. I didn't answer. And that silence seemed to make him even more uncomfortable. Have you ever noticed how silence can make people nervous? When someone expects a fight, and you give them nothing instead. Daniel leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "This place seems strange," he muttered. But the truth was, nothing strange had happened yet. Not really. At least not from my perspective. Because what Daniel didn't know was that this moment had been quietly forming for months. Let me take you back to when things started changing inside the house. 3 years earlier, when Daniel first moved in, he behaved like a guest. He thanked me for dinner. He asked before bringing friends over. He even mowed the lawn a few times. But something shifted after the first year. It was subtle at first. Melissa started referring to the house differently. She'd say things like, "when we renovate this place," or "when we update the master bedroom." The first time she said that, I smiled politely. Because I assumed she meant someday. But later I realized she meant something else entirely. One evening I walked into the kitchen and overheard Daniel on the phone. "Yes, it's a great property," he was saying. "Large lot. Good neighborhood." I paused in the hallway. He was talking to a real estate agent. Not about buying a house. About selling one. My house. I stood there listening quietly while he described the place like it was already his. When he finished the call, he walked into the living room and saw me standing there. For a moment he looked surprised. Then he smiled casually. "Just exploring options," he said. Options. That word stayed in my mind all night. Because I realized something very important in that moment. Daniel wasn't waiting for the house. He believed it already belonged to him. Have you ever had that strange realization about someone you love? The moment you see them clearly for the first time. Not as the person you raised. But as the person they became. That night I didn't confront him. I didn't argue. Instead, after everyone went to bed, I made a phone call. It was late. Nearly midnight. The person who answered sounded sleepy but calm. "Hello?" "Ruth," I said. Ruth Calloway has lived next door to me for 25 years. She's 74 now, sharp as a tack, and one of the most practical people I've ever known. She was also my husband's closest friend. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. I told her everything. The real estate conversation. Melissa measuring the bedroom. The way Daniel had started referring to the house as if it were already his. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she asked a question that surprised me. "Eleanor," she said, "does Daniel actually know how that house is structured?" I smiled faintly. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure. You see, when my husband was alive, he had been extremely careful about our finances. He believed in planning ahead. And long before he passed away, he had insisted we organize the house legally in a very particular way. At the time Daniel was still young. He didn't pay much attention when lawyers visited the house. He didn't ask questions when documents were signed. And as the years passed, I began to suspect he never really understood what those documents meant. Ruth cleared her throat on the phone. "Have you looked at the trust agreement recently?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "And?" "It still works exactly the way he designed it." That's when Ruth laughed softly. Not cruelly. Just knowingly. "Well," she said, "that might become very important soon." Back in the nursing home office, Daniel was still sitting across from me. The silence between us had stretched longer now. Finally he stood up and started pacing. "This whole thing is ridiculous," he said. "Mom, you could have just told me if something was wrong." Something was wrong. But not the way he thought. The door opened again. Carla returned with a glass of water. But she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a tall man in a navy blazer. His name was Howard Grant. The nursing home administrator. He stepped into the room calmly and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, extending his hand politely, "I just received a call from your attorney." Daniel stopped pacing. "My what?" he asked. But Mr. Grant wasn't looking at him. He was looking at me. And the next thing he said made Daniel's face slowly lose its color. "Your attorney asked us to review the property documents connected to your admission today." Daniel frowned. "Property documents?" he said. Mr. Grant nodded once. "Yes," he replied calmly. "Because according to these papers." He opened the folder on the table. "The house your son believes he lives in." He paused. "May not legally belong to him at all." What kind of property documents could make a nursing home administrator question who owns a house? That's the question Daniel should have asked himself years ago. Instead, he stared at the folder on the table like it had suddenly appeared out of thin air. "My mom doesn't have a lawyer," he said quickly. Mr. Grant raised an eyebrow. "Oh, she does," he replied calmly. "In fact, her attorney called about 30 minutes before you arrived." Daniel turned toward me. "You called a lawyer?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry yet. Just confused. I took a sip of water and placed the glass back on the table. "Not today," I said. That seemed to bother him even more. "What does that mean?" Mr. Grant slid the folder across the table slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore asked us to confirm something important the moment she checked in," he said. Daniel shook his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. But Mr. Grant opened the folder anyway. Inside were copies of legal documents. Stamped. Signed. Organized very neatly. The administrator tapped the top page. "This," he said, "is the property trust agreement connected to the Whitmore residence." Daniel frowned. "Trust agreement?" Have you ever seen someone realize they might have misunderstood something important, but they're not ready to admit it yet? That was exactly what Daniel looked like in that moment. He leaned closer to the table. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Mr. Grant didn't react. Instead, he calmly turned another page. The Whitmore residence, he explained, was transferred into a family trust approximately 12 years ago. Daniel blinked. 12 years? Yes. That was the year my husband died. Daniel looked at me again. "Mom, why would you put the house in a trust?" I didn't answer. Because the truth was simple. I didn't. My husband did. And he did it for a reason. Let me explain something most people don't realize. When someone passes away, inheritance doesn't always happen the way people imagine. Sometimes property goes directly to children. Sometimes it's divided. But sometimes, if the person was careful, it goes somewhere else first. Daniel had assumed that after his father died, the house naturally became mine, and eventually his. But assumptions can be dangerous things. Mr. Grant continued explaining. The trust established by your father outlines several conditions regarding the house, he said. Daniel crossed his arms. Okay, and? Those conditions determine who can live there, who can sell the property, and what happens if the primary resident leaves. Daniel laughed nervously. Well, that's simple then, he said. My mom just moved out. So eventually the house will pass to me. Mr. Grant didn't smile. Instead, he slowly turned another page. That depends, he said. On what? Daniel asked. On the trustee. Daniel blinked again. The what? The trustee, Mr. Grant repeated. The individual responsible for enforcing the trust. Daniel frowned. Okay, so that's my mom. Mr. Grant shook his head. No. For the first time, Daniel looked genuinely unsettled. If it's not her, he said slowly, then who is it? Mr. Grant closed the folder. Mrs. Ruth Calloway. Daniel's head turned toward me. Ruth, he said. Yes. Ruth Calloway. My neighbor. My closest friend. And the woman who had quietly agreed, years earlier, to take on a very specific responsibility. You see, my husband didn't just create a trust. He designed it carefully. He believed that family sometimes needed guardrails. So the trust included one rule that Daniel had clearly never bothered to learn. The trustee, not the heirs, controlled the house. Daniel stared at the table. That doesn't make sense, he said. It does legally, Mr. Grant replied. But that's impossible, Daniel insisted. It's still my mom's house. Mr. Grant nodded calmly. Yes, he said. Well, she lives there. Daniel froze. What do you mean? Mr. Grant pointed to a paragraph in the document. The trust states that Eleanor Whitmore retains full residence rights for the duration of her life, he explained. Daniel relaxed slightly. Okay, so nothing changes then. But Mr. Grant wasn't finished. There is one additional clause. The room went quiet again. Daniel leaned forward slowly. What clause? Mr. Grant read directly from the page. If Mrs. Whitmore voluntarily leaves the residence and establishes permanent residence elsewhere. Daniel's face began to tighten. The trustee is authorized to immediately initiate a sale of the property. Silence. Real silence this time. The kind where the air feels heavy. Daniel blinked. Wait, he said. Mr. Grant continued calmly. In other words, if your mother permanently moves out of the house. He paused just long enough. The trust requires the house to be sold. Daniel's eyes widened. But she's not moving out permanently, he said quickly. Mr. Grant looked at him carefully. You just checked her into a nursing facility. Daniel turned toward me. Mom, you're coming back home after this. I folded my hands again. That depends, I said quietly. Daniel stood up. No. No, 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 he said. You can't do this. Mr. Grant tilted his head slightly. She didn't do anything, he replied. You did. Daniel's voice rose now. This is insane. It's still her house. Yes, Mr. Grant said calmly. And because of that, the trust clause has now been activated. Daniel's breathing grew heavier. What does that mean exactly? Mr. Grant slid one final document across the table. The trustee, he said, has already been notified. Daniel stared at the paper. And? Mr. Grant answered in the same calm voice. She approved the sale this morning. Daniel's mouth slowly fell open. But the biggest shock hadn't even arrived yet. Because the next page of the document revealed something Daniel never expected. The identity of the buyer. And when Daniel read that name, his entire face went white. Who was buying the house? That was the question sitting in the middle of the table now. Daniel stared at the document like the letters might rearrange themselves if he blinked enough times. But they didn't. The name stayed exactly the same. Ruth Calloway. For a moment, Daniel didn't say anything. Then he laughed. Not a real laugh. The kind people make when they think something must be a mistake. This is stupid, he said, pushing the paper slightly away from him. Ruth lives next door. Why would she buy the house? Mr. Grant folded his hands. Because she's the trustee, he replied calmly. Daniel shook his head. No. That doesn't make sense. But the truth was, it made perfect sense. Years ago, when my husband created the trust, he had asked Ruth if she would serve as its trustee. Not because she wanted power, but because she understood responsibility. Ruth had watched Daniel grow up. She knew our family. And she also knew something else my husband believed deeply. People can change. Sometimes not for the better. That's why he didn't want Daniel controlling the house automatically. He wanted someone neutral watching over it. Daniel looked at me again. You knew about this? He asked. Yes, I said quietly. And you didn't tell me? I tilted my head slightly. You never asked. That answer made his jaw tighten. Have you ever noticed something about assumptions? People build entire plans around them. And when those assumptions collapse, everything else falls with them. Daniel stood up again. No, he said. This is ridiculous. The house can't just be sold. Mr. Grant looked at him calmly. It can, he replied. But I live there. That doesn't change the trust. But my things are there. Also irrelevant. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. You're telling me I accidentally triggered the sale of the house, by bringing my mother here? Mr. Grant didn't answer immediately. Then he nodded once. Yes. The word hung in the air. Yes. Daniel turned toward me again. You planned this, he said. But I shook my head slowly. No, Daniel, I said. You planned it. That confused him even more. You packed my suitcase. You called the car. You signed the nursing home papers. I simply didn't stop you. That's when something strange happened. Daniel stopped talking. He just stared at the table. And for the first time that entire day, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Uncertainty. You see, my son had spent the last 3 years acting like the house was already his. He talked about renovations. He talked about resale value. He even talked about turning the backyard into a rental unit someday. But the one thing he never did was read the documents his father signed. Mr. Grant opened the folder again. There is one more detail you should know, he said. Daniel looked up slowly. What now? The trustee has already begun the transfer process. Daniel frowned. What transfer? The sale. Daniel laughed again, but this time it sounded hollow. You can't sell a house overnight. Mr. Grant nodded. That's true. Then he turned the page. But you can begin the process if the buyer has already been approved. Daniel leaned forward. And who approved the buyer? Mr. Grant pointed to the signature. Ruth Calloway. Daniel stared at the paper again. But Ruth doesn't have that kind of money, he said. I smiled faintly. You'd be surprised. You see, Ruth had quietly built a very successful accounting firm years ago. She sold it when she turned 65. After that, she invested her money carefully. Very carefully. But that still wasn't the part Daniel didn't understand. Because Ruth wasn't just buying the house for herself. She was buying it for someone else. Daniel rubbed his forehead. This is insane, he said. I'll just talk to Ruth. You can, Mr. Grant replied. But it won't change the trust. Daniel looked at me again. You're coming back home, he insisted. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked him a question. Daniel, why did you really send me here? He opened his mouth. Then closed it again. Because you needed care, he said finally. But we both knew that wasn't true. He had told the truth once already. The night he stood in my doorway. Your room is the biggest one in the house. For Baxter. The dog. That memory seemed to hit him at the same moment. He looked down again. And the room fell quiet. Then Mr. Grant spoke again. There is one more appointment scheduled tomorrow morning, he said. Daniel looked exhausted now. What appointment? The real estate inspection. Daniel's head snapped up. The what? The property inspection, Mr. Grant repeated. Standard procedure before closing. Daniel's face turned pale again. You're already selling the house? Yes. Daniel shook his head. No, that can't happen. But the truth was, it already had. Because while Daniel was busy arranging my move into a nursing home, Ruth had already started arranging something else. Something that would happen the very next morning. And when Daniel finally learned what Ruth had planned for the house, he realized something that terrified him. He wasn't just losing the property. He was losing the only home he had left. What happens when someone suddenly realizes the roof over their head is about to disappear? That's the question sitting in Daniel's mind now. Because a few minutes ago he thought he was securing his future. And now he was realizing, he might have just erased it. Daniel sat down slowly. The confidence he had walked into the nursing home with was gone. Completely gone. He rubbed his forehead and stared at the documents again like they might magically change if he focused hard enough. They can't just throw me out, he said. Mr. Grant remained calm. No one is throwing you out, he replied. But the property will be sold according to the trust terms. Daniel looked up quickly. And how long do I have? That depends on the closing process, Mr. Grant said. But typically buyers take possession within 30 to 45 days. 30 to 45 days. Daniel exhaled slowly. That's not enough time, he muttered. For the first time that day, he sounded scared. Have you ever seen someone suddenly realize they've made a decision they can't undo? That moment when the consequences finally become real? Daniel looked at me again. You can stop this, he said. His voice wasn't demanding anymore. It was almost pleading. Mom, just tell them you're moving back home. I looked at him quietly. Home? I asked. Yes. The same home where my bedroom was given to the dog? He didn't answer. Or the home where my suitcase was already packed before you even talked to me? Still nothing. You see, Daniel had expected a fight. He had expected anger. But calmness, Calmness is harder to deal with. Mr. Grant closed the folder. There is one more thing you should understand, he said. Daniel looked up tiredly. What now? The trustee doesn't just oversee the sale, Mr. Grant explained. She also decides who the buyer is. Daniel nodded impatiently. Yeah. Ruth. Yes. And? Mr. Grant leaned back slightly. Ruth already explained her plans for the property. Daniel frowned. What plans? Mr. Grant hesitated for just a moment. As part of the purchase agreement, she intends to transfer the house to a different resident. Daniel blinked. What resident? Mr. Grant turned toward me. Mrs. Whitmore. Daniel froze. What? I folded my hands again. You see, Ruth wasn't buying the house to take it away from me. She was buying it to protect it. Years ago my husband had explained something very clearly when he created the trust. He said houses don't just hold furniture. They hold memories. And sometimes, those memories need protecting. Daniel shook his head. That doesn't make sense, he said. Mr. Grant explained patiently. Once the trust sells the house to Ruth, she has the legal authority to transfer ownership however she wishes. Daniel's voice rose again. So she's giving it back to my mom? Yes. But that means. Daniel stopped mid-sentence. Because the realization finally landed. The house would belong to me again. Not the trust. Not Daniel. Me. And once that happened, Daniel would no longer have any claim to it at all. Daniel stared at the table. That's not fair, he said. Fair. That word always fascinates me. Because fairness usually only matters when someone loses. Daniel, I said gently, did fairness matter when you packed my suitcase? He swallowed. You're blowing this out of proportion. Am I? Let's revisit the facts. You told your 72-year-old mother she couldn't stay in her own bedroom anymore. You replaced her with a dog. And you signed nursing home paperwork without asking what it meant. Does that sound like fairness? Daniel didn't answer. Because sometimes the truth arrives in a room and everyone knows it. The door opened again. Nurse Carla stepped inside. She had clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. She looked at Daniel kindly. You should probably go home, she said. Daniel laughed bitterly. Apparently I might not have one soon. Carla gave a small nod. Yes, she said softly. That can happen when people forget whose house it really is. Daniel stood up slowly. For a moment it looked like he wanted to argue again. But instead he grabbed the folder from the table. I'm calling Ruth, he said. Mr. Grant nodded. You're welcome to. Daniel walked toward the door. Then he stopped. And turned back to me. Did you ever plan to tell me about the trust? He asked. I looked at him calmly. Yes. When? When you started acting like the house was yours. That answer seemed to hit him harder than anything else. He opened the door. And walked out. But what Daniel didn't know yet was that Ruth had already arrived at the house. And what she was doing inside that living room at that exact moment was something Daniel never expected to see.